He acknowledged the emotional weight of Perkins's argument, but pivoted immediately to the Western Conference gauntlet LeBron was facing at the time: Utah, Phoenix, the Clippers, Denver, Dallas, and argued that the volume and quality of competition LeBron was navigating in the West made his current path uniquely difficult in a different way. Who has the best roster in the Western Conference? Out of all those teams you name, who has the best roster? And they went back and forth on this, Perkins arguing from the roster perspective that the Lakers had 6 future Hall of Famers, that LeBron had more help than ever. Stephen A. arguing from the competition perspective, that the West was deeper and more dangerous than any conference LeBron had navigated before. 2 smart men, 2 legitimate perspectives, 0 agreement. That's the show. That's always been the show. And their ability to go that hard at each other without it turning personal, at least most of the time, is what made them so compelling to watch together. But there was one moment where it did turn personal, where the debate crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. In March 2023, during an MVP race discussion on First Take, Perkins made a claim that stopped the entire conversation cold. He stated on air that roughly 80% of NBA MVP voters were white, and then pointed to a pattern of white winners, including Nikola Jokic, Dirk Nowitzki, and Steve Nash, noting they weren't top 10 scorers, and said, "What do those guys have in common? I'll let it sit there and marinate." The implication was clear: racial bias in MVP voting, and the set got uncomfortable fast. J.J. Redick, who was a co-host at the time, confronted him directly, accusing Perkins of implying white voters were racist. The debate turned personal and awkward in a way that studio debate shows rarely do. Stephen A. later acknowledged the discomfort in a conversation with Bill Simmons, saying both sides had gone too far and that he'd had to step in. And the very next day, ESPN didn't just move on, they addressed it on air. To correct something here from yesterday's show, when Kendrick Perkins said 80% of NBA voters for the MVP award are white, ESPN issued a public correction and apology on air for Perkins' comments. That's not a small thing. That's the network going on record and saying what our analysts said was factually incorrect, and here is the correction. Charles Barkley called the take one of the stupidest things I've ever heard, and later mocked it on Inside the NBA, saying you're only voting for him because he's black. A sarcastic jab that landed on national television and went viral almost instantly. But even after all of that, the public correction, the Barkley mockery, the backlash, Perkins wasn't fired, he wasn't suspended, he was still on air. Because at ESPN, controversy isn't a career ender, sometimes it's a career accelerant. The confrontation, the confidence, and the complicated truth. By 2025, Kendrick Perkins had been at ESPN long enough to stop worrying about whether he belonged there. He had the contract, he had the multi-year extension. In October 2024, ESPN had announced another multi-year deal that expanded his role across NBA Countdown, ABC's NBA Countdown, NBA Today, First Take, Get Up, SportsCenter, and Hoop Streams. He was everywhere. He was established. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of ESPN's most visible and important voices in NBA coverage. And with that security came something that you could argue was either admirable self-confidence or the kind of on-air boldness that makes executives nervous, depending on which day you caught it. The debates with Stephen A. didn't slow down. They escalated in March 2025 after Nikola Jokic put up a 31-21-22 triple-double masterpiece. Perkins went on NBA Countdown and started building to a Jokic MVP argument, and Smith cut him off mid-sentence. Not gently, not diplomatically. He looked at Perkins and said, "You are not doing that today, Big Perk. We're not going to do this today, and we ain't going to start this narrative where all of a sudden Shai Gilgeous-Alexander gets compromised for league MVP again." That's a colleague shutting you down on national television.
And Kendrick Perkins, former NBA champion, Boston Celtics legend, and 2-year ESPN analyst, was sitting on the outside looking in. Not because he wasn't good enough, not because the audience didn't respond to him, but because of something far more boring and far more frustrating: corporate red tape. Perkins had been at ESPN since 2019, working on a day rate basis, roughly $2,500 per appearance. He wasn't a star yet. He wasn't guaranteed anything. He was a former player trying to prove he belonged in a room he'd never trained for. And by the time the playoffs arrived in his second year, he had completely exhausted his allotted appearance days under his contract. The system said he was done for the season. No more days, no more appearances. Come back next year. But Stephen A. Smith had other plans. Smith wanted Perkins on First Take for a full week during the playoffs. Not a guest spot, not a single day, a full week of the most-watched NBA coverage of the year. And when the network bureaucracy pushed back, when the answer came back as no, Smith didn't accept it. He picked up the phone. Perkins later recounted the story on the Straight Game podcast, describing exactly how it went down. Smith called him directly, told him to relax, said he would handle it, and Perkins remembered the exact words, that he'd be hearing from the bosses the next day. The next day, the bosses called, and what ESPN did next was remarkable. They didn't just approve more appearance days, they tore up his existing contract, which still had another year remaining, and replaced it with a brand new 3-year deal worth approximately $700,000 per year. They took a man who was making $2,500 in appearance and turned him into a full-time, salaried, contracted analyst, making more money than most people will ever see in their lifetimes. One phone call from Stephen A. Smith. Perkins later said, "They tore that contract up. I had another year on that contract. They tore that up and gave me a whole other contract for another 3 years and like $700K a year." And that moment, that single intervention is the foundation of everything that has happened between these two men since. Because Perkins has never pretended it didn't happen. He has said publicly and repeatedly that he has Stephen A. Smith's back against anybody. Because Smith had his back when it mattered most. But having someone's back doesn't mean you agree with everything they say. Now here's where the debates start, because once Perkins had a platform, a real, secure, well-compensated platform, he started using it the way only Kendrick Perkins could use it, loudly, directly, without apology. And one of the topics he kept returning to over and over and over again was LeBron James. Perkins has always been a LeBron defender. He played alongside him briefly. He knows on a first-hand level what LeBron brings to a locker room and to a franchise. And so when debates about LeBron's legacy, his path to titles, his difficulty of competition would come up on First Take, Perkins would go all the way in. Is this LeBron's most challenging path to a title? Hell no, Molly. No, 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 and no. Like an anybody think different is crazy. Strong words. Classic Perk. But Stephen A. had a different take, and he wasn't about to let Perkins just claim the floor unchallenged. I'm crazy? Damn it, the biggest challenge. Now they're in it. The energy on set when these two lock in on a disagreement is something that can't be manufactured. And the thing about their LeBron debate specifically is that Perkins brings something A simply cannot bring. He was in those locker rooms. He was there. He lived it. We already know that. So that just from hearing your tone, I know you about to disagree with me, and I knew we couldn't go a whole show without getting into it. And then Perkins dug in on why he believed LeBron's return to Cleveland was the hardest championship path of his career. When LeBron James went back to Cleveland, okay, right? That was his hardest path. He talked about the Dan Gilbert relationship, the hostile ownership situation, the weight of going back to a city that had been publicly humiliated by LeBron's departure, then going deep into the locker room history of what it actually felt like to be there when everything was fractured. I was in that locker room, not when he won the title, but I was there the 2 years before then when he had lost to Golden State. And what Perkins was talking about being in that locker room during those losses was real. It wasn't a talking point. It was lived experience. And that's exactly what makes him valuable on television. He's not reading off a script. He's pulling from memory. The broader point Perkins was making in that debate was that LeBron, winning a championship in Cleveland, coming back 3-1 down against a 73-win Golden State Warriors team, was the hardest thing LeBron had ever done. And the personal dimension of the Dan Gilbert relationship, the fractured front office dynamic, made it even harder. Stephen A. characteristically pushed back hard.
Was his name Chuck Barkley, Kendrick Perkins. But beneath the personal shots, what emerged was a broader media criticism that Barkley had been carrying for years and that Perkins had become the embodiment of in his eyes. Not laziness, not dishonesty, but the specific habit of large sports networks returning week after week to the same franchises, regardless of which teams were actually playing the best basketball. But the reason the season's been going great for the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Oklahoma City Thunder, the criticism was, not just of Perkins. Barkley's frustration had been building for years. Perkins fired back immediately, calling Barkley a senior citizen on social media and telling him to keep that same energy when they were eventually face-to-face. The clip went viral again, framed as "the beef is back," and then it was over. With both men a matter of weeks away from sharing a building, Perkins confirmed on the Stephen A. Smith Show that they'd talked it out. "Barkley has no beef no more. We actually talk and conversate. We squashed that beef. That little beef that we had, it wasn't nothing but some pork chops." Pork chops. Years of punching bags, rap diss tracks, roach insults, and cross-network shots reduced to pork chops. That reduction is the clearest possible evidence that the whole thing was always content, carefully maintained, mutually beneficial, ratings-friendly content built on top of a genuine relationship. A relationship with real edges underneath all the theater. Edges that were forged not in a television studio, but in a locker room in 2010, when two men who had just finished trying to beat each other in the playoffs found themselves on the same team and discovered almost immediately that sharing a locker room would test them in ways the playoffs never had. The history that made it all real. Strip away the punching bags and the rap diss tracks and the roach insults and the ESPN set crash, and what you find underneath all of it is something that television beef rarely has. Two men who actually know each other, who competed against each other at the highest level the game offers, who shared a locker room and a season and a moment that neither of them has let go of in 15 years. The theater works precisely because it is built on something real, and that real thing started in 2010. The Eastern Conference semifinals that year pitted Kendrick Perkins' fourth-seeded Boston Celtics against Shaquille O'Neal's top-seeded Cleveland Cavaliers, led by LeBron James. The Celtics were the defending Eastern Conference champions. The Cavaliers had the best record in basketball and were the consensus favorite to not just win the East, but to win the whole thing. What followed was a six-game war, physical, grinding, contested from start to finish, that the Celtics won 4-2. Inside that war was a specific matchup. Perkins, the gritty defensive center who had built his entire career on making the life of opposing bigs as difficult and unpleasant as possible, going directly and repeatedly at Shaquille O'Neal, the aging but still enormous, still formidable force who had joined Cleveland mid-season and was everything most centers in the league had spent their careers desperately trying to avoid. Contemporary reports from that series documented the brutality of the matchup in real time, recording how Perkins had spent the series going belly-to-belly with the beast that is Shaquille O'Neal, trading hits, absorbing contact that would have moved most people sideways, and engaging in the kind of trash talk that functions as a parallel game, running inside the main one. There were moments in that series where the two almost came to blows. In the third quarter at TD Garden, Perkins held his ground against a man who had a half-foot and more than 100 pounds on him. The Celtics advanced, and then, months later, those two opponents became teammates. In August 2010, Shaq signed a 2-year deal with the Boston Celtics. At 38 years old, body deteriorating beneath him in ways that were becoming impossible to paper over, chasing one last ring alongside Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, Rajon Rondo, and the man he had just spent 6 games trying to bulldoze, Kendrick Perkins. The team started 28-3. The early returns looked like a heist, like one of those rare roster constructions where every piece falls perfectly into place and the league has no immediate answer for what you've built. And then, in the daily, unglamorous grind of training camp at the facility in Waltham, Massachusetts, something happened that Perkins carried with him for 15 years without telling a single person outside that locker room.
It was Shaq who made sure that wasn't going to happen. The only problem that I had with what Kendrick says, "There's nobody in the world watch more basketball than me," that was Barkley's grievance, singular and specific. The implication that he didn't watch the games. Not the credibility attack, not the platform critique, not the career stats jab. He watched more basketball than anyone. And that claim cut at the one thing he was most proud of professionally. The thing that's really funny about it, Shaq is so sensitive at times, right? Because I was going to let it go, and he's like, no, no, no. Barkley was done. Shaq was not. My mama told me growing up, we kill all roaches. And I said, so that's how the whole roast thing came up. Shaq is so crazy, he made a rap diss song. Shaq, 4-time NBA champion, Hall of Famer, owner of a certified music career from the 1990s, recorded an actual rap diss track aimed at a basketball analyst whose career averages sat at roughly 5 points and 5 rebounds per game. That happened. Shaq made a rap diss record about Kendrick Perkins. The depth of commitment that required is its own kind of testament to how personally Shaq took the whole thing. For his part, Perkins navigated the fallout with more nuance than the headlines gave him credit for. He told the Michael K. Show that he had great respect for both of those legends, and that it's all fun and games, that the